James Mitchell stared at the small, weathered house that was now his new home. The paint was chipped, the windows slightly crooked, but there was something about it that felt right. Or at least, that's what he kept telling himself. Beside him, Karen, his new wife, stood with her arm wrapped around his waist, her eyes scanning the property with cautious optimism. Lucas, her 10-year-old son, fidgeted near the porch, kicking at the loose gravel beneath his sneakers. "Lucas, come help us unpack," Karen called gently, but the boy didn't move. James noticed the tension in the way Lucas held himself, a tension that mirrored his own unease. Moving to this small town was supposed to be a fresh start, a way to leave behind the wreckage of their past lives. But the ghosts of what they were running from felt like they had followed them here, lingering in the corners of their new beginning. James forced a smile and nudged Lucas's shoulder. "Come on, buddy. Let's see what we can do to make this place ours." Lucas glanced up at him, his expression unreadable, before reluctantly joining them in the task of unloading the moving truck. The afternoon sun beat down on them as they carried boxes inside, each one filled with fragments of their old lives. Photos, clothes, memories better left buried. Inside, the house was quiet, too quiet. The kind of quiet that made James's nerves twitch. He set down a box labeled kitchen and wiped the sweat from his brow, trying to shake off the sense of unease creeping up his spine. This was their chance to start over, to build something new. But as the minutes ticked by, he couldn't ignore the gnawing feeling that they hadn't escaped anything at all. Karen's voice broke through his thoughts. "James, can you get the toolbox from the truck? There's a shelf in Lucas's room that needs fixing." "Sure," James replied, grateful for the distraction. He headed back outside, the warm breeze doing little to calm his nerves. As he reached the truck, he spotted Lucas standing by the edge of the driveway, staring intently at something in the distance. "What's up, Lucas?" James asked, trying to sound casual as he grabbed the toolbox. Lucas didn't answer immediately, his gaze fixed on the road that led into town. Finally, he spoke, his voice quiet. "Do you think he'll find us?" James's hand tightened around the toolbox handle. He didn't need to ask who Lucas was talking about. The boy's father, Karen's ex-husband, had been a looming shadow over their lives since the day James met them. A man with a past as dark as James's own, but without the will to change. And now, with the man out of prison, that shadow felt more real than ever. "He won't," James said, injecting as much confidence as he could muster into his voice. "We're safe here." Lucas finally looked up at him, searching James's face for something. Reassurance, perhaps, or maybe just the truth. Whatever it was, James hoped he could deliver it. "We'll be okay," he added, softer this time, as much for himself as for Lucas. Lucas nodded, though the uncertainty in his eyes remained. Without another word, he turned and headed back toward the house. James watched him go, a heavy weight settling in his chest. He wanted to believe the words he'd just said, wanted to believe that they could build a life here, free from the ghosts that haunted them. But as the evening shadows began to stretch across the yard, James couldn't shake the feeling that the past wasn't done with him yet. That night, the house creaked and groaned as it settled into its old bones, sounds that kept James awake long after Karen and Lucas had gone to bed. He lay on his back, staring up at the ceiling, every noise amplified in the stillness. It wasn't just the house that unsettled him. It was the silence, the kind that filled the gaps between breaths, the kind that made him hyper-aware of his own heartbeat. Beside him, Karen slept soundly, her breathing steady, her hand resting lightly on his chest. James envied her ability to slip into sleep so easily, to let go of the worries that clung to him like a second skin. He gently moved her hand, careful not to wake her, and slipped out of bed. In the kitchen, the clock on the wall ticked softly, each second dragging on as James poured himself a glass of water. He leaned against the counter, staring out the window into the dark yard. The moonlight cast long shadows across the lawn, making the trees look like twisted, looming figures. A cold shiver ran down his spine, and he quickly turned away from the window, cursing himself for being so jumpy. He took a deep breath, trying to steady his nerves. This was ridiculous. They were safe here. He had to believe that. But as he sipped his water, his mind wandered back to the things he couldn't forget. The night he almost lost everything, the screams that haunted his dreams, the reason he left the force. No matter how hard he tried to bury those memories, they had a way of resurfacing at the worst times. A soft creak echoed down the hallway, pulling James from his thoughts. He set the glass down, his senses on high alert. It could have been the house settling again, but something felt off. He moved silently, the old training kicking in, and made his way toward the sound. At the end of the hallway, a sliver of light spilled out from Lucas's room. The door was slightly ajar. James's heart skipped a beat as he reached for the doorknob, pushing it open just enough to peer inside. Lucas was sitting on the edge of his bed, fully dressed, his small backpack at his feet. He looked up as James entered, his eyes wide with a mixture of fear and determination. "Lucas, what are you doing up?" James asked, keeping his voice low. "I was going to leave," Lucas whispered, his voice trembling. "Before he finds us." James felt a pang of guilt and sadness. He knelt beside the boy, placing a hand on his shoulder. "Lucas, you don't have to run. I promised you we're safe here." Lucas shook his head, his eyes filling with tears. "You don't understand. He's not going to stop until he gets me. He always finds us." The weight of Lucas's words hit James like a punch to the gut. This wasn't just about fear. It was about survival, something Lucas had been forced to learn far too young. James struggled to find the right words, to convince Lucas that things would be different this time. "We're not going to let him hurt you," James said firmly. "I won't let anything happen to you or your mom." Lucas sniffled, wiping his eyes with the back of his hand. "What if he does find us? What if he comes here?" James's jaw tightened. "Then he'll have to go through me first." For a moment, Lucas just stared at him, processing what James had said. Finally, he nodded, a small flicker of trust igniting in his eyes. "Okay," he whispered. James helped Lucas back into bed, taking the backpack and setting it aside. He stayed with him until the boy's breathing evened out, signaling that he had finally drifted off to sleep. But James knew there would be no rest for him tonight. As he quietly closed the door to Lucas's room, the resolve hardened in his chest. If the man came for them, if he dared to show his face in this town, James would be ready. He would protect his new family, no matter the cost. But as he returned to bed, that familiar, gnawing feeling of dread curled around his heart, reminding him that the past was never truly done with him. The next morning, the tension from the night before lingered like a heavy fog. James woke early, his mind already racing with thoughts of how to secure the house, how to ensure Karen and Lucas were safe. He moved quietly around the bedroom, careful not to wake Karen as he dressed, and slipped out into the hallway. Lucas's door was still closed, and James hesitated for a moment, listening for any signs of movement inside. When he heard nothing, he continued downstairs, his footsteps muffled by the worn carpet. In the kitchen, the morning light streamed through the windows, casting a warm glow over the room. But the peace it offered did little to soothe James's nerves. He poured himself a cup of coffee, the familiar routine grounding him somewhat. As he sipped, his mind turned over the events of the night, analyzing every word Lucas had said, every nuance of the boy's fear. He needed to know more about Lucas's father to understand the threat he posed. Karen had been vague about the details, brushing off James's concerns with assurances that the man was out of their lives. But Lucas's terror was real, and James couldn't shake the feeling that they were far from safe. He was still deep in thought when Karen entered the kitchen, her hair tousled from sleep, a soft smile on her face. "You're up early," she said, moving to kiss him on the cheek. "Couldn't sleep," James replied, trying to keep his voice casual. Karen nodded, reaching for a mug. "I get it. New place, new start. It's a lot." James watched her carefully as she poured her coffee. There was a slight tension in her movements, a hint of something she was trying to hide. He wondered if she had sensed his unease, if she knew just how much Lucas's words had affected him. "Karen," he began, choosing his words carefully, "we need to talk about Lucas's father." She stiffened slightly, her back still turned to him. "What about him?" "Lucas is scared," James said gently. "He's terrified that his father will find him here." Karen took a deep breath before turning to face him, her expression guarded. He won't find us, James. We're safe. I want to believe that, James replied, setting his cup down. But Lucas doesn't. And if he's that scared, we need to be prepared. Karen's eyes softened as she looked at him, and she set her mug aside. James, you don't know what it was like living with that man. He's manipulative, controlling, but he's also a coward. The moment things get tough, he runs. He won't come after us. But what if he does? James pressed. What if he's changed? Prison can do that to a person. Karen's expression faltered, and for the first time, James saw the fear she had been hiding. I don't know, she admitted quietly. I don't know what he's capable of anymore. James reached out, taking her hand in his. That's why we need to be ready. I'm not trying to scare you, Karen, but we have to face this. She looked down at their joined hands, a tear slipping down her cheek. I just want Lucas to feel safe, to feel like he can have a normal life. And he can, James assured her. But we have to be smart about this. We can't pretend the danger isn't real. Karen nodded, wiping her tear away. What do? We start by getting more information, James said. I'll talk to some people, see what I can find out about him, where he's been, who he's been in contact with. And we make sure this house is secure. Locks, alarms, whatever it takes. Karen squeezed his hand, a look of determination crossing her face. Okay, we'll do it together. James felt a wave of relief at her words. They were in this together, and that made all the difference. But as he looked into Karen's eyes, he saw the same fear that had been haunting him. No matter how strong they were, the shadows of the past were closing in. And deep down, James knew that it was only a matter of time before they had to confront the darkness head-on. Later that afternoon, James found himself driving through the narrow, winding roads that led out of town. He had made a few calls earlier, reaching out to some old contacts from his days on the force. Now, he was on his way to meet one of them, an ex-detective named Frank Pearson, who had retired to a quiet life in the outskirts of the county. If anyone could help him dig up information on Lucas's father, it was Frank. The countryside around him blurred as his thoughts raced. He knew Karen was right about one thing. Lucas's father had always been a coward, quick to run when things didn't go his way. But James also knew that people could change, especially after spending years in prison. The man might have a vendetta now, something that could drive him to do the unthinkable. And that possibility gnawed James, refusing to let him rest. The house appeared around a bend in the road, a modest single-story structure with a wide porch. Frank was sitting there, a cup of coffee in hand, watching as James pulled up. As James got out of the car, Frank stood, his weathered face breaking into a grin. Well, if it isn't James Mitchell, Frank called out, his voice gruff but warm. I heard you were playing house in the middle of nowhere. James forced a smile as he walked up to the porch. Had to get away from it all, Frank, but I see you haven't strayed far from the action. Frank chuckled, waving a hand at the quiet surroundings. This is about as far from the action as you can get, my friend. Come on, let's sit. They settled into the worn wooden chairs on the porch, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the yard. Frank took a sip of his coffee, studying James with a knowing look. You didn't come all the way out here for a social visit, did you? Frank asked, his tone turning serious. James shook his head. No, I need your help. Frank nodded slowly, setting his cup down. I figured as much. What's going on? James hesitated for a moment, then began to explain everything. How he'd met Karen and Lucas, how they'd moved to the small town to start over, and how Lucas's father had recently been released from prison. As he spoke, Frank listened intently, his expression growing more serious with each passing minute. So, you think the bastard might come after them? Frank asked when James finished. I don't know, James admitted. But Lucas is terrified, and I need to be sure. I need to know what we're up against. Frank leaned back in his chair, his eyes narrowing in thought. Lucas's father? What's his name? Gregory Tanner. James replied, the name leaving a bitter taste in his mouth. Frank nodded, as if the name rang a bell. I'll see what I can dig up. Might take a few days, but I'll get you what you need. Thanks, Frank, James said, relief flooding through him. Frank waved off the gratitude. Don't thank me yet. We don't know what we're dealing with. But I'll tell you this, James. If this guy's as dangerous as you think, You need to be ready for anything." "I'm ready," James said, though even as he spoke the words, he wasn't entirely sure he believed them. "I'll do whatever it takes to protect them." Frank's gaze softened slightly. "I know you will. But remember, this isn't just about you anymore. You've got a family to think about now." James nodded, the weight of that responsibility pressing down on him. "I won't let them down." Frank stood, clapping a hand on James's shoulder. "Good. Now go home and take care of them. I'll be in touch as soon as I have something." As James drove back to town, the sun dipping low on the horizon, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. Frank would help him get the information he needed, and then he would make sure that nothing happened to Karen and Lucas. But as the darkening skies settled over the countryside, a small voice in the back of his mind whispered a warning. Sometimes, knowing the truth was more dangerous than being in the dark. And James was about to find out just how true that was. By the time James returned home, dusk had settled over the small town, casting everything in shades of deep blue and purple. The house was quiet, with only the faint glow of the kitchen light visible through the windows. As he stepped inside, the familiar creak of the floorboards under his feet reminded him of how fragile this sense of peace truly was. Karen was in the kitchen, chopping vegetables for dinner. She looked up as he entered, a question in her eyes. "Did you find out anything?" "Not yet," James replied, leaning against the counter. "Frank's going to look into it. It might take a few days." Karen nodded, her hands slowing as she continued chopping. "I've been thinking, James, maybe we should just leave. Find another place. Start over again." James sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "And then what? We keep running forever?" She set the knife down, her expression weary. "I just want Lucas to be safe. I don't want to live in fear anymore." "I know," James said softly, reaching out to take her hand. "But we can't keep running. We have to face this. Frank's going to get us what we need, and when he does, we'll know what to do." Karen looked down at their hands, her thumb tracing circles on his skin. "What if it's not enough? What if—" A sudden, sharp knock at the door cut her off, the sound reverberating through the quiet house. Both of them froze, exchanging a glance that was heavy with unspoken fears. "I'll get it," James said, his voice steady despite the unease gnawing at him. He moved toward the door, each step measured and deliberate. When he opened it, a man stood on the porch, his silhouette framed by the dim porch light. He was tall, with broad shoulders and a face that looked like it had seen more than its fair share of trouble. For a moment, James didn't recognize him. But then the man spoke. "James Mitchell?" James's grip tightened on the doorknob. "Yeah, that's me." The man extended a hand, his gaze sharp and assessing. "Name's Robert Lawson. I'm a friend of Frank's. He sent me." James hesitated before shaking his hand, the man's grip firm and calloused. "Frank sent you." Lawson nodded, glancing over his shoulder as if checking to make sure they weren't being watched. "He thought you might need some extra help. Told me what's going on with your boy's father." James's instincts flared up. Why would Frank think we need help already? Lawson met his gaze, his expression grim. "Because Frank did some digging, and what he found isn't good. Gregory Tanner's been busy since he got out." A cold wave of dread washed over James. "What do you mean?" Lawson's voice dropped to a near whisper. "Tanner's been making connections with some bad people. People who owe him favors from inside. Word is he's been asking around about his ex and the kid." James's stomach churned. "So he's looking for them?" "That's what it looks like," Lawson confirmed. "And if he finds them, he's not going to come quietly." James stepped back, motioning for Lawson to come inside. The man followed, and James closed the door behind him, locking it with a sense of finality. Karen was waiting in the kitchen doorway, her face pale. "What's going on, James?" "This is Robert Lawson," James said, his voice tight. "Frank sent him. He's got news about Tanner." Karen's eyes widened, and she looked at Lawson, searching his face for answers. "What news?" Lawson didn't mince words. "Your ex-husband is looking for you, Mrs. Mitchell, and he's not alone." The color drained from Karen's face, and she gripped the doorframe for support. "What do we do?" James stepped forward, putting an arm around her shoulders. "We prepare," he said firmly, turning to Lawson. You got any ideas? Lawson nodded. First, we need to make sure this place is secure. I've got some equipment in my truck, cameras, alarms, the works. We'll set it all up tonight. James felt a surge of gratitude toward the man. Thanks, Lawson. We appreciate it. Lawson shrugged, his expression hardening. Frank's a good friend. He knew this was more than you could handle alone. And trust me, James, if Tanner comes knocking, we'll be ready for him. As Lawson headed back out to his truck to grab the equipment, James turned to Karen, pulling her into a tight embrace. We're going to get through this, he whispered, though the words felt heavy with the uncertainty of what lay ahead. Karen clung to him, her voice trembling. I'm scared, James. I know, he said, kissing the top of her head. But we're going to fight this time. No more running. But as he held her close, James couldn't shake the ominous feeling that this fight was only just beginning, and that they might not come out of it unscathed. Enjoying the video? Subscribe to our channel to receive more interesting content. Click the subscribe button and stay updated with the latest news. James spent the next several hours working alongside Robert Lawson, setting up the security system around the house. They installed cameras at every corner, covering all possible entry points, while motion detectors were placed along the windows and doors. As they worked, the night deepened, the stars obscured by thick clouds, casting the world into a heavy darkness. The only sounds were the occasional chirp of crickets and the steady hum of the devices as they came to life. Karen stayed inside with Lucas, keeping him occupied with a movie in the living room. She tried to keep things normal, but James could see the strain in her eyes every time he passed through to grab another tool or check on their progress. He wanted to tell her that everything would be okay, but the weight of the situation pressed down on him, making it hard to find the right words. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the last camera was in place, and Lawson stepped back, surveying their work with a satisfied nod. That should do it. If anyone so much as steps foot on the property, we'll know about it. James wiped the sweat from his brow, his muscles aching from the effort. Thanks, Lawson. I don't know how we would have done this without you. Lawson gave him a grim smile. You'd have managed, but now you don't have to worry about managing alone. He paused, glancing toward the house where Karen and Lucas were. You got a lot riding on this, James. You're doing the right thing, but you need to stay sharp. Tanner's dangerous, especially if he's desperate. James nodded, his jaw set. I know. I've dealt with guys like him before. Lawson raised an eyebrow. Maybe. But remember, this one's personal. That makes it different. James didn't need the reminder. He felt the difference in every fiber of his being. This wasn't just about catching a criminal or stopping a threat. It was about protecting the people he loved, about holding on to the life he was trying so hard to build. The stakes had never been higher, and the risks never more real. They finished up the last of the setup, and Lawson packed away his tools, ready to head out. As he was about to leave, he turned to James one last time. Keep your phone on you at all times. I'll be checking in, but if anything feels off, don't hesitate to call. James shook his hand, the firm grip a silent exchange of trust and understanding. I will. Thanks again, Lawson. With that, Lawson climbed into his truck and drove off into the night, the red taillights disappearing into the darkness. James stood on the porch for a moment, listening to the sound of the truck fading away, leaving behind the heavy silence of the country night. He took a deep breath, trying to center himself. Everything was in place, but the sense of unease still gnawed at him. The house was as secure as it could be, yet the vulnerability lingered, an undercurrent of fear that he couldn't shake. When he finally stepped back inside, Karen was waiting for him in the hallway, her arms crossed over her chest. Is everything set? She asked, her voice tight with worry. James nodded, forcing a reassuring smile. Yeah, we're all set. Lawson did a good job. We'll know if anything happens. Karen nodded, but her eyes didn't lose their tension. I'm going to check on Lucas. He fell asleep during the movie. Okay, James said, watching as she turned and headed down the hallway toward Lucas's room. He wanted to follow her, to be there with her as she checked on their son, but something held him back. Instead, he found himself wandering into the living room, where the remnants of the evening were scattered around. A half-finished bowl of popcorn, a blanket thrown across the couch, and the TV still softly playing the end credits of the movie. He sank down onto the couch, his body heavy with exhaustion, yet his mind racing with too many thoughts to allow for rest. The events of the past few days had turned their lives upside down, and now it felt like they were just waiting for the next blow to fall. As he sat there, the quiet of the house pressed in on him, the silence almost suffocating. He could hear the faint murmur of Karen's voice from down the hall, speaking softly to Lucas as she tucked him in. Her words were a comfort, a lullaby meant to keep the darkness at bay. But James knew it wasn't enough. Not this time. He reached for his phone, scrolling through the messages from Frank. The last one had come in just before Lawson arrived. A brief update that Frank was still digging, but hadn't found anything concrete yet. The lack of information was maddening. James needed something to act on, something more than just fear and speculation. After a few minutes, he put the phone down, his frustration mounting. There was nothing more he could do tonight. No more preparations to be made. He had done everything he could to protect them, but now he was left with the hardest part: waiting. Karen appeared in the doorway, her face softening when she saw him. "Lucas is asleep." I think the excitement wore him out. James managed a small smile. "That's good. He needs his rest." She crossed the room and sat beside him, leaning her head on his shoulder. "So do you," she murmured. He wrapped an arm around her, pulling her close. "I know, but I'm too wired to sleep." Karen didn't argue, just nestled closer, her presence a balm to his frayed nerves. They sat there in the quiet, drawing comfort from each other, even as the weight of the unknown loomed over them. Eventually, Karen spoke, her voice a whisper in the dark. "Do you think we'll ever feel normal again? Like we're really safe?" James hesitated, choosing his words carefully. "I think it's going to take time, but we'll get there. We just have to keep going one step at a time." She sighed, the sound heavy with the same exhaustion that James felt deep in his bones. "I just want this to be over." "I know," he said, his voice soft but firm. "But we're in this together, and we're going to make it through. I promise." Karen nodded against his shoulder, and they lapsed into silence again, the only sound the steady tick of the clock on the wall. James's thoughts drifted as the minutes passed, his eyelids growing heavy despite his earlier tension. He knew that sleep would come eventually, but it would be a restless one, filled with the same unease that had plagued him since they moved here. As they finally rose from the couch and made their way to bed, James couldn't shake the feeling that the night was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. And in the darkness, he knew that he would be ready, no matter what came their way. The next few days passed in a blur of tense vigilance. James was constantly on edge, his senses heightened as he moved through the motions of their daily routine. Every creak of the house, every unfamiliar car driving by, set his nerves on fire. He spent most of his time checking and rechecking the security system, making sure everything was functioning perfectly. But even with the cameras and alarms in place, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was coming. Karen tried to keep things as normal as possible for Lucas's sake. She took him to the park, helped him with his homework, and did her best to shield him from the fear that had settled like a dark cloud over their home. But even Lucas could sense that something was wrong. He was quieter than usual, his eyes darting to the windows whenever he heard a sound outside. On the third day, James received a call from Frank. He answered immediately, his heart pounding in his chest. "James, I've got some news," Frank said, his voice steady but carrying a weight that made James's stomach drop. "What did you find?" James asked, trying to keep his voice calm. "Tanner's been making moves," Frank said. "He's been spotted in a few places around the state, asking questions about Karen and Lucas. He's not being subtle about it either. It's like he wants people to know he's looking for them." James's grip tightened on the phone. "Why would he do that? It doesn't make sense." "It's like he's trying to flush you out," Frank replied. "Make you panic. Make a mistake." James cursed under his breath. "We're not going anywhere. He won't find us." "Good," Frank said, his voice firm. "That's the right move. But you need to be careful, James. Tanner's got nothing to lose, and that makes him dangerous." "What else do you know?" James pressed, needing more information, more clarity. Frank hesitated for a moment before continuing. "I've been hearing some things, rumors. Tanner's not just looking for revenge. There's something more driving him. I don't know the details yet, but I'm working on it. James's mind raced, trying to piece together what Frank was telling him. What do you think it is? I wish I knew, Frank admitted. But whatever it is, it's making him reckless. You need to be ready for anything, James. Keep your guard up. James nodded, even though Frank couldn't see him. I will. Thanks, Frank. Let me know if you find out anything else. Will do, Frank said before ending the call. James lowered the phone, his thoughts spinning. Tanner was out there, getting closer, and whatever he was planning, it was more than just revenge. James could feel the storm gathering, the tension in the air building with each passing hour. He had to figure out what Tanner was after and stop him before it was too late. That evening, as the sun dipped low on the horizon, James gathered Karen and Lucas in the living room. He had been dreading this conversation, but he knew it was necessary. Is everything okay, James? Karen asked, her eyes searching his face. James took a deep breath, trying to find the right words. I talked to Frank today. Tanner's been looking for you, for Lucas. He's getting closer. Karen's face went pale, and she instinctively reached for Lucas's hand, pulling him closer. What does he want? I'm not sure, James admitted. But Frank thinks it's more than just revenge. Tanner's after something, and we need to be ready for whatever it is. Lucas looked up at James, his eyes wide with fear. Is he coming here? We don't know, James said gently, kneeling down to be at eye level with Lucas. But we're going to do everything we can to keep you safe, okay? You're not alone in this. Lucas nodded, but the fear in his eyes didn't fade. He looked at Karen, his voice trembling. Mom, what's going to happen? Karen's voice was steady, but James could see the effort it took for her to stay calm. We're going to be okay, Lucas. We have to trust that your dad won't find us. Lucas's gaze flicked to James, searching for reassurance. James placed a hand on the boy's shoulder, giving it a gentle squeeze. We're prepared, Lucas. And if anything happens, we'll handle it together. Karen stood and began pacing the room, her thoughts racing. Should we go to the police? Maybe they can help. James shook his head. We don't have enough to go on yet. The police might not be able to do anything until Tanner actually makes a move. And by then, it could be too late. Karen stopped pacing, her arms wrapped around herself as if trying to ward off the fear creeping in. So, what do we do? Just wait. We stay vigilant, James said, his voice firm. We keep an eye on the security system, we stick together, and we don't let Tanner catch us off guard. Karen nodded slowly, her eyes meeting his. And if he does come, then we fight, James said without hesitation. We protect each other no matter what. There was a moment of silence as the weight of his words settled over them. Lucas looked between his mother and James, his small face etched with worry. I don't want him to hurt you, Lucas said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. James's heart clenched at the boy's fear, and he moved closer, pulling Lucas into a hug. He won't, I promise. Karen joined them, wrapping her arms around both of them as if she could shield them from the world. They stayed like that for a while, drawing strength from each other, the room filled with a quiet determination. As the night deepened, James's thoughts returned to the conversation with Frank. Tanner was coming for them, and whatever his twisted motivations were, James knew he had to be ready. The clock was ticking, and with each passing second, the danger grew closer. When they finally broke apart, Karen insisted on putting Lucas to bed, trying to maintain some sense of normalcy in the midst of the chaos. James watched them go, his mind still racing. There was so much he didn't know, so much he couldn't control. But one thing was clear. He wouldn't let Tanner take anything from him. Not this time. As he sat alone in the living room, the silence pressed in, thick and suffocating. The house, with all its new security measures, felt more like a fortress, but James couldn't shake the feeling that the enemy was already inside. Not physically, but in the way Tanner's presence haunted their every thought, their every move. James leaned back in his chair, closing his eyes for just a moment, trying to find a sliver of peace. But in the darkness behind his eyelids, all he could see was Tanner's shadow creeping closer, his intentions as dark and twisted as the night outside. And James knew that the battle was far from over. In fact, it was only just beginning. The following day dawned gray and overcast, the kind of weather that seemed to seep into your bones and weigh down your spirit. James woke early, the remnants of a restless sleep clinging to him like a shroud. He glanced at Karen, who was still asleep beside him, her face peaceful despite the turmoil that churned beneath the surface of their lives. He envied her ability to find rest, even if only for a few hours. Quietly, he slipped out of bed and made his way downstairs. The house was still, the kind of quiet that felt like the calm before a storm. James couldn't shake the tension coiled in his chest, the sense that something was about to happen. The unease had grown stronger overnight, a gnawing feeling that told him time was running out. He brewed a pot of coffee, the familiar routine doing little to ease his nerves. As the dark liquid dripped into the carafe, James's mind raced with thoughts of Tanner, where he might be, what he might be planning. The uncertainty was maddening, the lack of control infuriating. He was a man used to action, used to facing problems head-on, but this situation was different. This was a waiting game, and James hated waiting. As he poured himself a cup, he heard footsteps on the stairs. Karen appeared in the doorway, her hair tousled, worry etched into her features. "You're up early," she said softly, coming to stand beside him. "Yeah, couldn't sleep," James replied, handing her a mug. She took it with a grateful smile, though it didn't reach her eyes. "I know the feeling." They stood in silence for a moment, sipping their coffee as the morning light struggled to break through the clouds outside. The tension between them was palpable, the weight of unspoken fears pressing down on them both. Finally, Karen broke the silence. "What are we going to do today? We can't just sit around waiting for something to happen." James considered her question, knowing she was right. They needed to keep busy, to distract themselves from the looming threat. But what could they do when the danger felt so imminent, so close? "We could take Lucas to the park," Karen suggested, her voice hesitant. "Let him burn off some energy. He's been so quiet lately. I think he's scared." James nodded slowly. "Yeah, that might be a good idea. Keep things as normal as possible for him." Karen studied his face, searching for something. Reassurance, perhaps, or maybe just a hint of the man who used to be so sure of everything. "And what about you, James? What are you going to do?" He met her gaze, knowing he couldn't hide the truth from her. "I need to check in with Frank, see if he's found out anything new." Karen's shoulders sagged slightly, and she nodded. "I figured. Just be careful, okay?" "I will," he promised, pulling her into a brief hug. "We're going to get through this, Karen. We just have to take it one day at a time." She nodded against his chest, and for a moment, they stood there, drawing strength from each other. But the moment was fleeting, the reality of their situation crashing back in like a tidal wave. "Go wake Lucas," James said, releasing her. "I'll get ready, and we'll head out." Karen gave him a small, strained smile before turning to go upstairs. James watched her go, the weight of his responsibility settling heavily on his shoulders. He had to protect them, no matter what it took. After a quick shower and a change of clothes, James grabbed his phone and dialed Frank's number. The phone rang a few times before Frank picked up, his voice gruff as always. "James, what's up?" "Just checking in," James said, trying to keep his voice steady. "Any news?" Frank hesitated, and James's heart skipped a beat. "Yeah, I've got something, but you're not going to like it." "Tell me," James demanded, his grip tightening on the phone. "Tanner's been spotted in town," Frank said, his tone grave. "Near your place. He's asking around, trying to find you." James's blood ran cold. "How close?" "Close enough," Frank replied. "I don't know how much time you have, but it's not much. You need to be ready, James." A surge of adrenaline shot through James, his mind racing. Tanner was here, closing in on them. The waiting game was over. "Thanks, Frank," James said, his voice tense. "I'll take it from here." "James," Frank's voice softened slightly, a note of concern creeping in. "Don't do anything rash. Keep your head." "I know," James replied, though he wasn't sure he could keep that promise. "I'll be in touch." He ended the call, his heart pounding in his chest. Tanner was close, too close. The plan to take Lucas to the park now seemed foolish, a risk they couldn't afford to take. But they couldn't stay here, either. They needed to move, to stay one step ahead of Tanner. James hurried upstairs, finding Karen in Lucas's room, helping him pick out clothes for the day. "Change of plans," he said, his voice brisk. "Tanner's in town." Karen froze, her eyes widening with fear. "He's here?" James nodded. "We need to go. Now." Lucas looked up at them, confusion and fear mingling on his young face. "Where are we going?" James knelt down beside him, trying to keep his voice calm. "We're going on a little trip, buddy. Just for a while. But we need to leave right now, okay?" Lucas nodded, his trust in James evident in his wide eyes. "Okay." Karen moved quickly, grabbing a bag and stuffing it with essentials, clothes, snacks, a few toys for Lucas. James double-checked the security system, making sure everything was set before they left. The cameras and alarms were all functioning, but he knew they wouldn't be enough to stop Tanner if he really wanted to get in. Within minutes, they were packed and ready to go. James ushered Karen and Lucas out the door, his eyes scanning the street for any sign of danger. The neighborhood was quiet, too quiet, and every shadow seemed to hold a threat. They piled into the car, James taking the driver's seat. As he started the engine, Karen glanced at him, her face pale but resolute. "Where are we going?" "Somewhere safe," James replied, though he wasn't entirely sure where that would be. "We'll figure it out as we go." Karen nodded, her hand resting on Lucas's shoulder in the back seat. "We trust you, James." He glanced at her, a wave of emotion crashing over him. He didn't know what lay ahead, didn't know if they would make it through unscathed, but he knew he couldn't fail them. He wouldn't. As they pulled away from the house, James kept one eye on the rearview mirror, watching for any sign that they were being followed. The road stretched out before them, a long, winding path that led into the unknown. But wherever it took them, James knew one thing for sure. They were done waiting. Now it was time to act. James drove with a steady hand, his eyes darting between the road ahead and the rearview mirror. The tension in the car was thick, pressing down on them like a weight they couldn't shake. Karen sat beside him, her hand gripping the armrest, while Lucas was quiet in the back seat, his small hands clutching a stuffed animal he'd grabbed at the last moment. The boy's wide eyes were glued to the passing scenery, but James knew he wasn't really seeing any of it. The road stretched out in front of them, leading away from the town that was supposed to be their safe haven. The clouds overhead were thick and dark, promising rain, but the storm that loomed felt like it was more than just weather. James could feel it in his bones, a sense of inevitability that gnawed at him, telling him that no matter how far they drove, they couldn't outrun what was coming. Karen glanced at him, her voice low and tense. "Where are we going, James?" "I'm not sure yet," James admitted, his gaze flicking to the rearview mirror again. "Somewhere far from here. We'll find a place to lay low until we figure out our next move." Karen nodded, but the uncertainty in her eyes was clear. "Do you think Tanner's following us?" "I don't know," James said, his voice tight. "But I'm not taking any chances. We'll keep moving until I'm sure we've lost him." Lucas shifted in the back seat, his voice small and scared. "Is he going to find us, Dad?" James's heart clenched at the fear in Lucas's voice, and he forced himself to speak calmly. "No, buddy. We're going to stay ahead of him. You're safe with us." Lucas nodded, but the anxiety in his eyes didn't fade. James wanted to reach back, to give the boy some comfort, but he couldn't take his hands off the wheel, couldn't afford to lose focus for even a second. They drove in silence for what felt like hours, the landscape around them changing from suburban neighborhoods to open country roads. The sky grew darker, and soon the first drops of rain began to spatter against the windshield. James turned on the wipers, the rhythmic swish adding to the tense atmosphere in the car. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, James spotted a small, run-down motel at the side of the road. It was the kind of place that didn't ask questions, that catered to travelers who didn't want to be found. It was perfect. "We'll stop here for the night," James said, pulling into the gravel parking lot. Karen looked at the motel, her face reflecting the unease he felt. "Are you sure it's safe?" "As safe as we're going to get right now," James replied. "We need to rest, and we need to figure out our next move." Karen nodded, and they all got out of the car, the rain now falling steadily. James grabbed the bag from the trunk, and led them to the motel office. The place was as shabby as it looked from the outside, with peeling wallpaper and the faint smell of mildew. The man behind the counter barely glanced up as James paid for a room, handing over a key without a word. They made their way to the room, and James unlocked the door, pushing it open to reveal a small, dimly lit space with 2 beds and a television that looked like it hadn't worked in years. It wasn't much, but it would do. Lucas hesitated in the doorway, looking around the room with wide eyes. "This place is kind of scary." James forced a smile, trying to keep things light. "It's just for tonight, Lucas. We'll be out of here in the morning." Lucas nodded, still clutching his stuffed animal, and Karen guided him to one of the beds, sitting down beside him. She pulled him close, wrapping an arm around his shoulders as if she could shield him from the fear that lingered in the air. James set the bag down and began checking the room, making sure the windows were locked and the door was secure. He knew it was a futile effort if Tanner found them, but it was something to do, something to keep his mind from spiraling into the worst-case scenarios that haunted him. Once he was satisfied that the room was as secure as it could be, James sat down on the other bed, running a hand through his hair. The exhaustion that had been building over the past few days was beginning to catch up with him, but he knew he couldn't afford to let his guard down. Karen watched him, her eyes filled with concern. "You should rest, James. You haven't slept in days." James shook his head. "I'll sleep when I know we're safe." Karen didn't argue, but the worry in her expression deepened. She looked at Lucas, who was already half asleep against her side, his exhaustion finally winning out over his fear. She stroked his hair, her voice soft. "He's so scared, James. I hate that he has to go through this." "I know," James said quietly, "but we'll get through it. I promise." Karen looked at him, her eyes searching his for reassurance. "Do you really think we'll be okay?" James wanted to say yes, to tell her that everything would be fine, but the words caught in his throat. Instead, he reached over and took her hand, giving it a gentle squeeze. "We'll do whatever it takes. I won't let anything happen to either of you." Karen nodded, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. She leaned over and kissed James's cheek, her voice barely above a whisper. "I trust you." James held her gaze, the weight of her trust settling heavily on his shoulders. He had to protect them, had to keep them safe no matter what. But the truth was, he didn't know how much longer he could keep this up, how much longer he could keep running. The night wore on, the rain drumming steadily against the window. Lucas had fallen asleep, his small form curled up beside Karen, who was lying down next to him, her eyes closed but her breathing uneven. She was awake, just trying to find a moment of peace. James remained seated on the edge of the other bed, his eyes fixed on the door. He knew sleep wouldn't come for him, not tonight. Every sound outside, every rustle of the wind, made his heart race, made him imagine Tanner lurking in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to strike. As the hours dragged on, James felt the exhaustion pulling at him, but he refused to give in. He couldn't let his guard down, not when Tanner could be out there closing in on them. He thought about what Frank had said, about Tanner being reckless, driven by something more than just revenge. Whatever it was, James knew it was coming for them, and he had to be ready. The darkness outside seemed to press in on the room, suffocating and heavy. James's thoughts spiraled as he tried to anticipate Tanner's next move, tried to stay one step ahead of a man who had nothing left to lose. And as the night wore on, James could feel the storm building inside him. A storm of fear, of anger, of desperation. The time for running was almost over, and when the storm finally broke, James knew that only one of them would be left standing. James stayed awake through the night, his eyes never leaving the door. The rain had stopped sometime after midnight, leaving the world outside the motel cloaked in an eerie silence. The kind of silence that made every creak of the building, every shift of the wind sound like a threat. James's exhaustion weighed heavily on him, but he forced himself to stay alert. The memory of Frank's warning echoed in his mind. Tanner was out there, getting closer, and James couldn't afford to let his guard down. Karen had finally fallen asleep next to Lucas, their bodies curled together for warmth and comfort. James watched them for a moment, the rise and fall of their breathing a small comfort in the midst of his anxiety. He wished he could join them, wished he could close his eyes and escape the relentless fear, if only for a little while. But every time he tried, his mind raced back to the same terrifying thought. What if Tanner found them? He stood up, unable to sit still any longer, and began pacing the small room. His mind spun with plans, scenarios, and contingencies, ways to get them out, ways to fight back if Tanner showed up. But no matter how many times he ran through the possibilities, the uncertainty gnawed at him. He was up against a man who had nothing left to lose, and that made Tanner dangerous in a way James wasn't sure he could fully prepare for. A faint noise outside the room snapped him out of his thoughts. James froze, his heart pounding in his chest. It had been so quiet for so long that any sound now felt like a warning. He moved quickly and silently to the window, peering out through the thin curtain. The parking lot was empty, the lone streetlight casting long shadows across the gravel. But something didn't feel right. The hair on the back of James's neck stood on end, a primal instinct telling him that danger was near. He turned back to the room, his eyes landing on Karen and Lucas. They were still asleep, oblivious to the tension that crackled in the air. James hesitated for a moment, then decided it was better to be safe than sorry. He walked over to Karen and gently shook her shoulder. "Karen," he whispered urgently. "Wake up." She stirred, blinking groggily as she came to. "James? What's wrong?" "I heard something outside," he said, keeping his voice low. "I think Tanner might be here." Karen's eyes widened, and she sat up quickly, her hand immediately going to Lucas's shoulder to wake him. The boy stirred, confused and disoriented, but Karen hushed him gently, trying to keep him calm. "Get your shoes on," James instructed, moving to grab the bag they had packed. "We're leaving now." Karen nodded, her face pale but determined. She helped Lucas put on his shoes, whispering words of comfort to him as she did. James moved to the door, his hand hovering over the lock as he listened for any sound from the other side. The silence was oppressive, thick with tension, but James knew that didn't mean they were alone. He turned back to Karen, who was now standing beside Lucas, ready to move. "Stay behind me," James said, his voice firm. "Whatever happens, just keep moving." Karen nodded, gripping Lucas's hand tightly. James slowly unlocked the door, his muscles tensed, ready for anything. He pushed it open just enough to peer outside, scanning the parking lot for any sign of movement. It was still empty, but that did little to ease the tension in his chest. James stepped out first, motioning for Karen and Lucas to follow him. They moved quickly but quietly, making their way to the car parked a few feet away. James's eyes never stopped moving, scanning the shadows for any hint of Tanner's presence. He couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, that Tanner was somewhere nearby, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. They reached the car, and James unlocked it with shaking hands. Karen helped Lucas into the back seat, buckling him in as quickly as she could. James kept watch, every nerve in his body screaming at him to move faster, to get them out of there before it was too late. Just as Karen was about to climb into the passenger seat, a figure emerged from the shadows on the other side of the parking lot. James's heart dropped into his stomach as he recognized the man, tall, broad-shouldered, with a face twisted in anger and determination. It was Tanner. James didn't hesitate. "Karen, get in the car!" he shouted, his voice cracking with urgency. Karen didn't need to be told twice. She dove into the passenger seat, slamming the door shut just as James ran around to the driver's side. He fumbled with the keys, his hands shaking so badly that it took him a moment to get the key into the ignition. The engine roared to life, but before James could throw the car into gear, Tanner was there, slamming his fists against the driver's side window. "Get out of the car, James!" Tanner bellowed, his voice filled with fury. "You can't run from me!" James's heart raced as he threw the car into reverse, the tires screeching against the gravel as he backed out of the parking spot. Tanner tried to hold on to the door handle, but James jerked the wheel, sending him stumbling back. He didn't wait to see if Tanner would get back up. He floored the gas pedal, the car lurching forward as they sped out of the parking lot. Karen was turned in her seat, watching Tanner through the rear window. "He's getting up," she cried, her voice filled with panic. James didn't look back. "Hold on," he said, his voice tight with fear and determination. He swerved onto the main road, pushing the car to its limits as they raced away from the motel. His eyes flicked to the rearview mirror, and his blood ran cold when he saw headlights in the distance, gaining on them fast. "He's following us," Karen whispered, her voice trembling. "I know," James replied, his mind racing. He had to think, had to find a way to lose Tanner before the man caught up to them. The road ahead was dark and winding, the rain-slicked asphalt glistening under the faint light of the moon. James pushed the car faster, the speedometer climbing as they barreled down the narrow road. But no matter how fast he drove, Tanner's headlights grew closer, his car gaining on them with terrifying speed. James's heart pounded in his chest, his knuckles white as he gripped the steering wheel. He had to lose him. He had to keep his family safe. Suddenly, James spotted a turnoff ahead, a narrow dirt road that wound through the trees. It was a risk, but it was their only chance. Without hesitation, he yanked the wheel to the right, the car skidding as it veered off the main road and onto the dirt path. The car jolted violently as they sped down the uneven road, the trees closing in around them. James could barely see the path ahead, but he didn't dare slow down. He could hear Karen's panicked breathing beside him, Lucas's terrified whimpers from the back seat, but all he could focus on was getting them out of there, getting them to safety. Tanner's headlights disappeared behind them, swallowed by the dense forest. James didn't know if they had lost him or if he had simply taken another route, but he couldn't afford to stop and find out. He kept driving, pushing the car deeper into the woods, praying that the road wouldn't end in a dead end. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the road began to level out, and the trees thinned, revealing a clearing up ahead. James slowed the car, his heart still racing as he navigated the vehicle into the open space. The car came to a stop, and for a moment, they all just sat there, the only sound the ragged breaths of fear and exhaustion. James turned off the engine, the sudden silence almost deafening. He glanced at Karen, who was staring straight ahead, her face pale and drawn. In the back seat, Lucas had his eyes squeezed shut, his small hands gripping the seatbelt with white-knuckled fear. "We're okay," James said, his voice shaky but filled with relief. "We're okay." James sat in the driver's seat, the weight of the last few minutes pressing down on him like a suffocating blanket. The clearing was quiet, the silence punctuated only by the sound of their heavy breathing. He could feel the tension in the car, the fear that hung in the air like a storm cloud, refusing to dissipate even though Tanner was no longer in sight. Karen was the first to break the silence, her voice trembling. "James, what do we do now?" James ran a hand through his hair, his mind racing. They had managed to escape Tanner for now, but he knew they couldn't stay in this clearing forever. Tanner was relentless. He wouldn't stop until he found them. And as much as James wanted to keep driving, to put as much distance between them and Tanner as possible, he knew they needed a plan. Something more than just running blindly into the night. "We need to figure out our next move," James said, his voice steady despite the fear gnawing at his insides. "But first, let's make sure we're not being followed." Karen turned to look out the back window, her eyes scanning the dark forest. "You think he'll find us?" James hesitated, not wanting to lie to her. "I don't know, but we can't take any chances." He opened the car door and stepped out into the cool night air, the chill a stark contrast to the warmth of the car. The ground beneath his feet was soft, damp from the earlier rain, and the forest around them was eerily silent. James walked around the car, his eyes and ears on high alert for any sign of movement, any indication that Tanner was nearby. But all he could hear was the rustling of leaves in the breeze and the distant call of an owl. After a few tense minutes, James returned to the car, satisfied that they were alone for the time being. He leaned against the door, his mind working through their options. They couldn't go back to the motel, that much was certain, and they couldn't keep driving aimlessly without a plan. Karen rolled down the window, her voice soft. "James, where are we going to go?" He looked at her, seeing the exhaustion and fear in her eyes. She was holding it together for Lucas's sake, but James knew she was just as scared as he was. Maybe more. And Lucas, who had been so brave through all of this, was now curled up in the back seat, clutching his stuffed animal as if it were the only thing keeping him grounded. "We need to get off the main roads," James said, trying to sound more confident than he felt. "Find somewhere to lay low for a while, regroup. Maybe we can contact Frank, see if he can help us again." Karen nodded, but the uncertainty in her eyes didn't fade. "Where can we go that Tanner won't find us?" James thought for a moment. Then an idea began to form. It was risky, but it might be their best shot. "There's a place about an hour from here. An old cabin in the woods, off the grid. I used to go there when I needed to get away, clear my head. It's isolated. No one knows about it except me." Karen looked at him, hope flickering in her eyes. "Do you think it's safe?" "It's safer than staying here," James said. "And it'll give us time to figure out our next move." Karen glanced at Lucas, who had finally opened his eyes and was watching them with a mixture of fear and confusion. "What do you think, Lucas? Do you want to go to the cabin?" Lucas nodded slowly, his voice small. "Will we be safe there?" James leaned in, his voice gentle. "I'll make sure of it, buddy. I promise." With the decision made, James got back into the car and started the engine, the low rumble breaking the stillness of the clearing. He navigated the car back onto the dirt road, driving slowly at first to avoid drawing attention. As they made their way deeper into the forest, James felt the tension in his chest begin to ease, just a little. The cabin was far enough off the beaten path that even if Tanner was still searching for them, it would take him a while to find it, if he found it at all. The drive was long and quiet, the dark forest pressing in on them from all sides. James kept his eyes on the road, but his mind was racing with thoughts of what might come next. He had to protect his family. There was no other option. But the reality of their situation weighed heavily on him. He had no idea how far Tanner was willing to go or how much time they had before he caught up to them. After what felt like an eternity, the road began to narrow, the trees closing in even tighter around them. James recognized the familiar landmarks, the twisted tree that leaned over the path, the large boulder that marked the turnoff to the cabin. He slowed the car, guiding it onto a barely visible trail that wound through the dense woods. The branches scraped against the sides of the car as they moved deeper into the forest, the path almost completely obscured by overgrown foliage. Finally, the cabin came into view, a small structure nestled among the trees. It was old, weathered by years of exposure to the elements, but still sturdy. James had spent many nights here in the past, using it as a refuge when life became too overwhelming. Now it was their best hope for staying hidden. He parked the car in a small clearing beside the cabin and turned off the engine. The silence that followed was almost deafening, the darkness pressing in on them from all sides. James turned to Karen and Lucas, giving them a reassuring smile. "We're here." Karen opened the door and stepped out, pulling Lucas along with her. The boy looked around, his fear momentarily replaced by curiosity. "This is where you used to come, Dad?" James nodded, opening the trunk to retrieve their bag. "Yeah, it's not much, but it's safe." They made their way to the cabin, James unlocking the door and pushing it open. The inside was just as he remembered it, simple with a small kitchen, a living area with a wood stove, and 2 bedrooms in the back. Dust covered the surfaces, and the air was musty from being closed up for so long, but it was shelter, and that was all that mattered right now. James set the bag down and turned to Karen. "We'll need to get a fire going, make this place livable. It's going to get cold tonight." Karen nodded, already moving to find some matches and kindling. Lucas stood in the middle of the room, looking around with wide eyes. James walked over to him, kneeling down to his level. "What do you think, buddy?" Lucas looked up at him, a small smile finally breaking through the fear that had clouded his face for so long. "It's cool, like a hideout." James ruffled his hair, relief washing over him at the sight of his son's smile. "That's right. It's our hideout. And as long as we're here, nothing bad is going to happen. I promise." As they worked together to get the cabin ready, James felt a sense of purpose return. For the first time in days, they weren't just reacting, they were taking control. They had a place to regroup, to think, and to plan their next move. And for now, that was enough. But as the night deepened and the fire crackled in the hearth, James knew this was only a temporary reprieve. Tanner was still out there, still hunting them. And when he found them, James would have to be ready for the fight of his life. Because this time, there would be no running. We hope you were moved and inspired by our story. We want to hear your opinion. Leave a comment below, share your impressions, and your own stories of resilience and hope. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel so you don't miss our next emotional videos. Join us on this journey and follow more incredible stories. See you next time.